of my friends out here. Oh, perfect, perfect. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Now, if you are new to Space for Change is a fantastic knowledge building community. We bring topics to the table to have a conversation with you, and also we co-create with you along the way. So Space for Change really is our opportunity to bring topics that are potentially adjacent, related, sometimes even opposite to what we usually speak to in change, and we think about ways to integrate them into our practice. We are constantly bringing different types of thought leaders to the table, and we're constantly asking you for feedback as well to make sure that we are also giving you exactly what you want to hear. So, hello from Auckland and Sydney. Who else can I see? The Philippines. Hello, hello. New York City. Hi, Sandra. Goodness, the whole world's here with us today. So today's episode is Deep Resistance, exploring the dark side of change. Does anyone else think Star Wars when you think of that? I definitely do. I'm a big Star Wars nerd. Today we've got Paul Matthews, who's going to be speaking to us. I'll let Andrew introduce you to him later on. But today's session is going to be really, really special, right? Because resistance to change is a cosmos-wide cause of project delay or failure. So at some point in our careers, whether you are a change practitioner, project manager, team lead, mother, father, goddaughter, friend, you're going to resist it. You're going to experience resistance. So I personally see this as both a professional and a personal development opportunity. But I'm about to hand over to Andrew, and you can introduce our wonderful speaker today and get us kick-started.
Amazing. Christina, what an intro. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for dialing in early in the morning if you're in Australia, late at night if you're in South Africa or US. And so good to have you on board as always. Like Christina said, we do this monthly and all of the topics come from you, our community, who votes in our LinkedIn group, Space for Change. Before we get in, we want to hear from the community first. So Paul is quite a dynamic speaker. So we want to sort of hear about what resistance means for you first. And Paul's going to make some links into it so that we can address it and make it hyper-tailored, as we say at Mars, to all your needs. So I want to hear from the community. I want to hear from each and every one of you inside the chat in Zoom. Can you remember a time where you experienced some deep, dark resistance? And we really want to know how that manifests for you. What did that look like? What did that sound like? What did it feel like specifically for you? What's your biggest challenge in the space when it comes to resistance? Jump in the chat. I'm going to be looking at it and I'll call out some of the hairy ones and scary ones. But we'd love to hear from you. So Pooja, good to see you. It's been a while. Fixed mindset versus growth mindset. So some people having a very fixed mindset that things stay the same or skills are you're born with. Others have a growth mindset that says if you work hard at something, we go into it. Kathy, great to see you. She says avoidance. I see that a lot as well. So not making time for change. So there seems to be an intention for change, but we just don't have time. We're too busy and we avoid it. Oh, Shady Ann, that's such a good one. If someone goes, if it ain't broke, we're not going to fix it. And they can have a company bleeding out, money, employees, energy, and it's just, well, if it ain't broke, mate. So thanks for that, Shirley Ann. Karen from South Africa, my South African sister from another mister. So glad you have joined us. Karen says team members finding every excuse not to change. Yes, we get that a lot in Australia as well, so I can feel you on that. Oh, Claire from Brain Smart, nice to see you. Yay. She goes, bloody mindedness. Yeah, bloody mindedness. What does that mean, Claire? Do you mind jumping off mute for a second? What's bloody mindedness?
Just really digging your heels in. And when they say black, you say white, or that I experienced it in myself, where I was belligerent. There's a big word, obstreperous, you know, just sort of wanting to do and say the opposite of everyone.
I love it. I love it. We've got a term for that. We call it mismatching. So anything we say, they do the opposite. So they just mismatch as an avoidance. Thanks. That's a great one. Sandra says the whole we can't, we've tried it before, we've always done it like this, good idea, but. I hate that word but because it often just deletes everything before that you've said. And also I can't stand compliments like that. Oh, Andrew, you're so amazing, but. I'm sure we've all had those at some point. Christina says disrupting sessions with bad behavior. Absolutely. It's often attention seeking or misleading. Larissa said not valuing change management. That's actually quite a big resistor, where we know our clients need change. We know it needs to be managed, led, but they just don't see the value in it because they might see technology as more important or process. Amy says wanting to get the answers quickly versus taking the time to engage and having conversations. And often that looks for Amy like, just tell us what to do, just put us in training and give us a manual and tell us what to do. But we know it's the conversations that drive. A parent says, but we've always done it that way. I'll ignore it. If we just ignore it, it'll go away. We hear that a lot. So thanks, parent from New Zealand. Love the new word. Paul says so much to discuss here. Oh, Claire, thank you for writing that word. I'm from the third world, so I'm going to try to pronounce it. Obstreperous. Stroppy. All right. Darian, so good to see you, my friend from America. He said applying their own definition of change. So stymieing the change itself. Right. Love that one. Deline says resistance at times indicates potentially fear patterns for people. Yes, sometimes they're not trying to be difficult. It might be a resistance or a fear that needs to be spoken about. So we can actually reframe resistance. So I love that nugget there. And thank you, Ingrid, being ready to step outside of your comfort zone. Not many people realize that change requires that. It's almost like if you want change, you've got to change, right? And that can be very uncomfortable. Wonderful, thank you. So it feels like there's a lot of different topics around resistance here that have come up, but also let's not forget about resistance behind a smile. Some people look at you and go, yes, sure, yeah, this is great, love the change. And that's the hardest resistance to spot. So the good news is we have the incredible Paul Matthews, who is a really interesting human being because, one, he joined Space for Change last year. So it's really exciting when we have sort of from the community, for the community when it comes to speakers. So Paul, it's lovely to have you on board. I started reading Paul's book called Switch. So he's written a book that's all about us moving away from sort of telling people how to change. And someone did mention that, into having conversations that actually lead to change and encouraging people. So Paul's had a very interesting life story. In fact, if you read the first chapter, it starts off with Paul in India in a very bad car accident. So Paul has had also a lot of personal change that he's gone through. And if you guys have time to reach out to Paul and have a chat, he's got one of the most fascinating backstories, but also experience in leading some really complex change. We also work in clinical logistics, infrastructure as well, and we can really appreciate the complexity of not just change, but how those businesses are structured. So I'm going to hand over to Paul. Paul, welcome aboard to Space for Change.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking us through the deeper, darker forms of resistance today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to say good morning to everybody and ask for a thumbs up if you can see the big yellow screen. Yes, great. Thanks for that great introduction, Andrew. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And the first thing I want to say is this is a conversation. And anyone that knows anything about me knows I'm all about conversation. So much so, as Andrew said, I wrote the book about it, but more about that later. So please jump in. I'll be looking at the chat. I'll be looking at the screen. Don't resist my questions. I will be coming after you. And I've already got some questions that have sent through and I've been looking through the chat. So I'll address some of those. If I haven't, please jump in and talk to me. So the first thing I want to do is ask three big questions of you. The first one is, why me? Well, as Andrew intimated, I've done about 25 years of communication and change, both in Europe and also in Australia. I've got lots of war stories, but also, despite all the corporate experience, I now spend my time helping leaders and teams build impact and trust using powerful conversations. And most of that is actually around change. So I'll be dipping into all of that. The second question I want to ask is, why you? What are you doing here? You know, it's 7:30 in the morning here and it's freezing. I saw some of these in South Africa. They're just about to jump into bed. Please let me know in the chat, what do you want to get out of today? I'm interested to be here to connect with everybody, share my story, but also to look into What are the things that are stopping you moving past resistance? You can just let me know in the chat what you'd like to get out of today. Spot resistance behind the smile. I like that one. Great, great thinking, Laverne. We've all had that smiling assassin, haven't we, on our change project? Hear resistance opinions, great. Triggers and indicators, absolutely, Christina. I love that. Learning from others, absolutely. How to read resistance in the virtual world. Wow, I like that. We'll definitely be coming up with some strategies to address resistance, Carolyn. I'll just keep that ticking. I think we've got some goodies there, and I'll come back to those as we talk. The last question of my three, it's not the last question I'm going to ask today, is why now? And my response to that is, hell, now is our time. If we haven't had significant change in the last 2 years, when are we as change leaders going to be able to step forward? I feel like this is our spotlight. And I like to focus the change revolution, if you like, on 3 big fronts. And I'm sure you've all experienced these throughout your career. But for me, this is what's brought out the importance of conversations for me in the last 3 years. The change is happening at the workplace. I'd like to do a show of hands. How many people are actually in the office right now? Hands up, everybody. Anybody that's actually in a cafe? Anyone that's at home? Home, lots at home. Anyone in their car? In the park? In the pub? And that's the thing for me. I've realized now that workspace is actually here. It's not at the office, it's not at home, it's wherever people are actually doing work. So the change there is significant. The workforce, for me, this is the fundamental biggie of the change. And I'll get into the detail a bit more about that now. Our workforce is more diverse and more complex than ever it was before. And this, for us as change leaders, allows us to think about, well, what's the most important part of our change process? Please jump in the chat, let me know which is the most important part of the change management process for you. I'm keen to hear. I know over the years we've spent heaps of time, at least 10 or 15 years ago, data really wasn't that important for me as a change person. We didn't have access to huge, analytics that we do now. And so for me, data has become much more important. But I'm keen to see, what do you think is perhaps the most important part of your change plan? Clarifying the vision, absolutely. The design, strategy development, that's great. Ensuring people understand, absolutely. And for me, I realized that even though we have evolved as a change profession, we still very much rely on the fact that we have this enormous backlog of documents and activities. But in actual fact, what's really important, what really gets us change, is conversations. I invest so much time listening, building trust, that in fact it almost renders this the most important part of the change process. Anyone got any views on that? Anyone want to jump in, talk about the importance of everything on the right or some of the stuff on the left?
I'd like to just add one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I totally agree with the conversation and having and developing that rapport and empathy and understanding, because it changes the change from being done to them to being them an active part of the change.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Anyone else?
I'll go. I mean, dialogic change is also a mechanism of change. So dialogue is a conduit of change. And sometimes that also requires a plan. You know, there's a bit of design to it. There's a bit of structure to it. So
yeah,
that they're both very important to me, and it just all from that's why I said the design was the most crucial one. So I don't have an either or, but just like with good dialogue, you know, it is, and there's truth to this and there's truth to that.
yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. And I guess my point is that, you know, conversations have to happen once you've done all of the groundwork. And it's in my experience, some of these documents and the inertia and stuff in the planning process can actually create barriers for change. Them on their own are not enough. I am encouraging change managers and leaders to invest more heavily in conversational capability. And I'll talk a bit about that now. So I know somebody put in the chat earlier about how can we build strategies for avoiding resistance. Well, I've identified 3 major challenges facing change managers, people leaders, team leaders, and organizations generally. And it relates back to that system-wide change I spoke about earlier. I think we've got to look at, you know, some of the behaviors we talked about earlier on about people not showing up, the wry, smiling assassin. I think you've got to look at the bigger picture when it comes to the workforce. And the first bit about that is the major challenge around the evolution of the workforce. I know when I'm buzzing around organizations, I always see so many different generations at play. And I wanted to ask, how many people on this call was alive during the moon landing? Show of hands. Anybody? Karen, nice work. How many people had a Walkman with a cassette? Hands up. Yes, so did I. Great. Did anybody have a Razor folding scooter? Folding scooter? Yes, Hugo. Gen Y, there you go. So there's, you know, there's heaps of different generations on this call alone. And that to me demonstrates the complexity of the workforce. You know, there's actually going to be 5 generations in the workforce by the end of this decade. And that's really complex for us as change leaders to get to grips with. How do we switch on all of those people? And, you know, I think it's by 2028, 68% of the Australian workforce have going to be born since 1980. And for me, that's really scary because I was born in the 70s. So I naturally think everyone that was born in the 80s is really young and irresponsible. So there you go. The other thing that I would ask change leaders and organizations to explore is, what does that mean, the highly educated, evolved workforce? What does that mean for involving them in change? Because ultimately now, our employees, our leaders, and organizations generally are hardwired to be involved. You know, our education system, it immerses people now. There's no more lectures. And that's why I'm saying we should shift from telling people what to do to trusting them to contribute. So involving people doesn't come naturally to many leaders, and particularly many change leaders. So it's a new skill. The last part that I wanted to talk about was the importance and the science around building connection. So many people create resistance by telling others what to do, but the neuroscience behind that tells us that when we tell somebody what to do, you know, when we force change, we're actually limiting that person's ability to contribute. The neuroscience shows that it creates a fight or flight response in individuals, so they immediately go into resistance mode. Whereas when we're building conversations with our clients, with our managers, and with our organizations, different chemicals in the brain create a bonding response with the change. And so connecting in a way through conversation is much more productive, building trust. And so much so that I say trust is like rocket fuel for change leaders. If we can put trust in the tank, it's going to help us go further, faster on innovation, performance, and behavioral change. But yet, despite that, we're often in a scenario where we can't sidestep resistance. And some of those behaviors you outlined earlier show up. So I've created a diagnostic tool here to kind of inform our conversation. And I identify behaviors in resistance that are either proactive at the top or passive. We've already talked about a few of those. The others are about those that are overt resistance or covert. And I'd like to talk individually about each of these now. The first one that I identify is called refusal. Has anybody ever had anybody refuse to change? Can I see a show of hands? That was a deep nod, Darlene. That was a, oh my God, yes, I have. I definitely have had a refusal. And look, for me, this comes down to a sociological cause of resistance. And I've had people say to me, that is never going to happen, jog on. And I call this, it's actually known as sociological resistance. And I'll give you an example. I was working at a container terminal in Sydney, imports and exports coming in, huge containers. And we were actually automating the terminal. So transitioning 400 employees out and transitioning 75 robots in. And I don't know if anybody knows about the waterfront. Waterfront workers are the most militant workers on the planet. The Maritime Union is extremely powerful. So much so, we had an absolute blanket refusal, not just from an individual, but from the entire workforce. And this is simply because the union are politically opposed to automation. Their motto is unite and fight. So naturally, they were going to refuse. So they have a values-based resistance. They are never going to agree politically with automation. So seeing that, how are those behaviors showing up? The first thing that I was told at my job interview going into there was by the Director of Corporate Affairs saying, hey, look, we've had we've had unrest there before where we've called the police with the dogs. If it gets really bad, we'll fly you in a chopper. And I thought, I'm in. I'm so down for this job. And within weeks of going there, project team members had their tires slashed, all manner of intimidation. I remember going up and down in a lift to a mediation hearing with union employees, and the union rep was having a staring competition with one of the executives I was with. So intimidation, refusal, abuse, anything to really sabotage. And what's the solution here? It's mediation. So the powerful conversation that you need to have is really up through a third party. I'd like to see if anyone here has had any scenarios where you've had intimidation, refusal. Anyone experienced anything as bad as that? Samuel, you're nodding. Were you nodding for me?
Oh, I remember actually Chris and I were working on a workplace transition here in the US, and I remember at one point I got sworn at, and it became almost violent, where people did not agree not to have their offices and cubicles, and it was quite it was quite a first for me. And then at the airline at Qantas, I remember there was a huge program involving cabin crew. It went really hostile, unions and all that. So that was also, it took a while to get them to transition from one rostering model to the other.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else had any downright refusals, jog on kind of scenarios? Jump in, let me know how that showed up for you. The second type of resistance I identify is around psychological reasons. So it's proactive, but often it can be covert. And this is generally where people are opposed to, they make up the psychological reasons to not want to change. They absolutely believe that it's not their road to change. And an example of this for me was, I was working on a cultural change across the National Health Service, 1.4 million employees, a huge, that's like turning 10 oil tankers, not one oil tanker. So culturally trying to change the behavior of doctors and nurses. And I remember being in a room full of doctors. Our goal was to reduce the amount of infections caused by dirty hands in hospitals. And of course, dirty hands, doctors and nurses always actually kill patients because they don't wash their hands. And at the in the early 2000s, doctors would not accept this. And of course, their motto is do no harm. So it was very complicated to try and get doctors to accept that it wasn't the nurses killing people. Their mindset was, it's not us, it's them. And the conversation tone that we had to have was a consultation. So we had to just move beyond the individual and actually have a consultation with the entire medical profession to get them to change their standards of practice. So in this scenario, it's these two scenarios. It's actually, you know, one around values, the other's about professional standards and beliefs of their, you know, personal beliefs of their profession. And these two are actually about conversations about why. It's not even at the place of getting to how you change. It's mediation or consultation around why we're changing. Has anybody had those psychological barriers? Lots of nodding again, Darlene. I'm going to come to you. Tell me about that. What's behind that nodding?
I'm just reflecting on my career, and as a very junior manager, I was allocated my first team at 25, and I just remember everybody was about 20 years older than me. So yeah, you know, you get that language around wet behind the ears, and you know, who are you? I'm sort of just reflecting over managing teams, and I worked in finance, transactional accounting. So it's a, you know, it's often a very challenging space because finance people, and I used to work in that space, but it's the analytical, logical. They need to understand why, and the fluffy emotional stuff is sort of, you know, parked. So. So by no way, shape or form in terms of the unions or anything like that, but I think that emotional resistance to change when things had to, you know, when you're looking at new system implementations or new processes, or as I said, the 25-year-old junior manager trapezing in and trying to change things.
Trying to save the world. I like that. Change the world. Thank you. I'm going to keep going. The third type of resistance I identify is overt but passive. And I think we've all had passive experiences. Show of hands, who's had passive resistance? And I want to make a point here, because there's been a lot of talk on LinkedIn about passive aggressive behaviors. And I see passive aggressive behavior, I see that as a form of communication. So you can get passive aggressive behaviors in all of these quadrants. But I don't believe that in itself is a form of resistance. I think it's a form of how to communicate resistance. But if you disagree or support that, jump in. So yeah, overt passive behaviors. And this for me showed up when I was working at Sydney Water as their head of communications. We were doing a migration of their head office from the center of Sydney out to a place, you know, about 30 miles west called Parramatta. Nobody wanted to go there. Nobody wanted to transition from the city to the burbs. And this project had been talked about for about 20 years. Actually, nobody believed in it. And so everybody actually needed a lot of time to get used to the fact that we were transitioning. So they had a logical barrier, which is what I see as just the general response to change. Because after all, resistance is a natural response to change. But often what we see in our projects and, you know, in our audiences is people saying, I just need time. And for me, that shows up in that skills audit, the training, the refresher training, the moving people down the curve. I feel like this is the more natural response to change. So the logical, they're working through it in their brain. How? So that conversation is about participation. So getting them involved, getting them to come to the table with their ideas. And this is where the trust really comes to the table around not telling, asking. How are you going to change? How are you going to get there? Anyone had experience? I think we've all had a lot of deep experience, but I'd love to hear from somebody. Anyone want to talk about some projects that took some time, logical resistance. How's that chat looking, Andrew? Anything coming up in there?
It's looking good, but I mean, I can share on that. I see a lot of this with government. So when government clients tend to do it, there's this almost passive overt saying, oh, but we're so busy, there's not enough time, let's rethink this, let's make a plan on a plan on a plan.
Rescope.
Re-baseline, rescope, yes. So those words come up. And often I found it's the plan's not as important and the time's not as important as the discussion around planning and the participation around that. So I love that you've got participation there, because we use human-centered design, we use collaborative technology to get people to participate. And I find that once they have a little bit more control and input into the change, they come to the table a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see this a lot in government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that a lot, in the government departments I've worked in. But the word you used yesterday was about co-creation. If you can't co-create the change, you're always going to get resistance because you're forcing people, right? Thank you. The last type of resistance I see is passive and covert. So this is those people, particularly in government, that are, they're on the 28th floor. They've been there for 38 years and they are stuck. They're stuck. They cannot conceive how to change. It's not about the why. They don't care about the why. They just can't conceive how to do that. And I'll give you an example. I was working for a company called Transport for New South Wales. They have about 40,000 employees and they run all the railways, the ferries and the buses for Sydney. That's a big deal. And we were trying to modernize how we communicated with the guards on the trains and the drivers. There was about 3,000 of them. And we decided in our wisdom to give every one of them an iPad. Oh my God, it was like I'd asked them to jump on a rocket and fly to Mars. These are people, and if you've been to Sydney and you see a train driver or a guard, they've always got a backpack, and inside that backpack is a paper timetable. Not anymore. So we trained every single guard and every single driver on how to use an iPad. They gave them a free iPad. But you can imagine guards that, some of them are in their 60s, 70s, they haven't used this kind of technology. They're totally stuck on using a paper book and driving a train. So getting them to play with the iPad and find the stuff that they need was really, really hard because they were stuck. So that approach and that conversation is really around education. Anyone got an example? I see you smiling, Karen. Do you have an example where you've had to do a big educational conversation, or anybody else, to reduce resistance?
Lots of times. I was contracted to either upgrade or create new departments and research places. So introducing new technology, although I was kind of lucky, I was in medical research, so they're all into new and new things. But I even had to go down to designing new cleaning structures, and also when there was an upgrade in biological security safety, bringing in new restrictions, because the better science gets, the more things it discovers it's doing wrong. So, and there is multi-generational. The department heads were usually in their late 50s to even 70s or 80s. And then the young technicians coming in were 18, 20, so there was 3 generations in the units. But, I probably had it relatively easy because of the environment and the industry.
Yeah. And you can see now, can't you, why the evolution of the workforce and their capabilities and expectations, if we don't acknowledge that, and we don't build more trust, can potentially create barriers for ourselves.
Yeah, and I had the first change management I actually had to do was in a large organization that I came in as a contractor. And the first thing they said was, this is a family business, and it's quite old, but they've now the old managers of it's my way or the highway, telling their staff what to do or telling their staff, was no longer working. And the biggest tell was that they had a really high turnover of staff, especially the new staff they're coming in, because of that attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had so many conversations over the years about the benefits of telling people what to do versus asking them how. And yeah, even still now, I see, you know, relatively young managers still in that space, trying to tell their teams what to do, and the, you know, the cost and the impact is extraordinary.
I have a question. I actually see a combination of this in your grid, the I need time and I am stuck situation in a project that has been running for multiple years. And so we could talk about change. Oh, well, I need time. And oh, we've got to start the run state. Okay, we'll do this and we'll do that. We'll focus on change next year. And then we come back again. And so there's this loop. How do you handle something like that, a combination of the two bottom groups?
Yeah, look, I think every project will have a little flavor of each of these. And the reality is, you know, you might have a leader that's actually not on board. We've all had leaders that aren't on board, but, you know, having a leader that actually doesn't agree with the change or is getting told to do it by the executive, that's going to create psychological barriers. Whereas then their team are really not having the conversation with their leader at all. So they're not even on the same page. They don't even know where, you know, which type of resistance they're going to be. So I think definitely you will definitely have covert, overt, passive, a real combination. And I think the reality is that you might need to have lots of different types of conversations with lots of different audiences. That's basically where we're at, I believe. And I think it's, you know, it's a real skill to identify, okay, is this, as you know, those above the line are actually, you know, around values and beliefs. And those below the line are actually situational. So it's, I just need time to work out how to do this, show me how. Or I've been here a long time, I can't get my head around it, help me understand. So they're not political, it's more logistical. And I think I'm trying to identify what is the barrier for resistance. Is it a why conversation, those above? Or is it a how conversation, those below? I'm going to keep going. There's going to be plenty of time for more questions. I guess my big point here is about, as change leaders, project leaders, team leaders, our communication capability is like a roof. It can either lift or limit our results when it comes to change. And I want to really talk about, you know, your impact is really your key to success. If you have a passive way of communicating, then you're going to have disengaged and disconnected clients and employees. The trust is going to be absent. But if you become more proactive in identifying the resistance, building your skills as a, you know, a change manager in terms of how I host conversations, identify resistance, have a more purposeful and powerful conversation, then you're much more capable of being able to connect, involve, and activate your audience because your trust has increased substantially. And I work with lots of project teams and leadership teams to actually ask them, where are you on this ladder? I say to leaders, where would you put yourself on this ladder? And of course, I always have leaders saying, I'm probably powerful, purposeful, I'm pretty good, we're up there. And just going back to my example at Sydney Water, I worked there and was doing an outsourced project, 400 people getting outsourced. And I asked the leaders, you know, this is going to be a tough thing. We need to really communicate well. I asked them how, you know, where are you? And they all said good or excellent communicators. But then I asked the employees and they said, we never see these guys. And when we do, it's inadequate. So there's often a perception gap between where leaders think they are communicating the change and where they actually are. I'll leave you with a quote. When I wrote my book, which I'm going to talk about in a second, I interviewed Alex Goryachev, and he was head of innovation for Cisco, the world's largest IT provider, and he summed this up so eloquently. The way that you host conversations and communicate with your business can make the difference between stagnation and success. And I think that is really, really significant. I'm giving away 5 copies of my book to the first 5 people that sign up for my newsletter. The link is there, so please jump on. I send out a weekly newsletter about all things communication, change, trust, and culture. And I'll be posting 5 copies to the first 5 people that sign up today. I'd love to hear from you. But also, I'm going to leave that link just on the next page, so don't worry about it, guys. There's my contact details if you want to reach out. I love having conversations, as you probably imagined. Let's chat about that. Andrew.
All right, let's all jump off mute and give a round of applause to the amazing Paul Matthews. Thank you so much, Paul. Good news, we've got some time for a bit of a Q&A. So if you've got a question, let's pop off mute. And while we've got Paul here, let's ask away. So floor is open.
I'll start with one real quick. So I had a situation where I was working on a project. It was technology change transformation project. And we had this one senior leader who sat through all the training, was fantastic. But on day 1, she refused to work. And it was a whole week and she refused to work. Her team stopped working because they were watching her. And I hung around for another week. And it had actually turned out that she refused to work because she didn't know how to turn on her new laptop. She was ashamed. So I was actually curious on that matrix, what type of resistance would that sit under? That was definitely a miss in the early conversations of understanding the change impact. It wasn't just the software, but it was the hardware that was changing for this person.
So thank you, Christina. I love this because I think it's really, it's a really great question, because I used to see this all the time where, you know, the management's perception is that it's a performance issue. And that was actually behavioral. She did not know. So I would say she's below the line, because the conversation that you had revealed that actually she was stuck. You know, but it was coming across to the leaders or yourself as a, you know, third-party observer that potentially she was just being obstructive and refusing. It wasn't a values-based resistance. It was environmental. It was logistical, yeah. And I guess the conversation is what would surface that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's interesting, because that's the power of the conversation that you were talking about.
Absolutely. There's a lot of presumption around just because somebody isn't using their new iPad, it's a performance issue. Actually, it's probably something much bigger than that. You know, as you said, there might be some shame there because they weren't listening at the training, they couldn't absorb the information, or they just don't know how and they're stuck. Carolyn, you've got your hand up. Hi there.
Hi there. Christina, a question for you. How did you uncover the issue?
Oh, I had to request to stay in Charlotte for an extra week for my manager. And I just made myself available, because at that point she was refusing to speak to anyone. So I just had to make myself available, approachable. And when I was around long enough so she could see that I wasn't going to judge her, that's when she pulled me into a room and broke down crying.
So she did it. She came to you. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's important to note, not just on that, on every one of these part of the quadrant, is that change is a natural response. Resistance is a natural response to change. You know, we're stuck. We're all a little bit stuck in our ways. And it does take a while for us to mentally get there sometimes. And then, you know, sometimes the physicality around it's got to catch up, the hardware, the software, the training. But I would say it's very rarely, not very often, that it's in that top, you know, the refusal quadrant. And if you're going into a territory where that is happening, you already have your lawyers to hand or your general counsel already. You already know that they're going to be one of your key stakeholders.
Samuel, did you want to add to that? I noticed in the chat you had something to add.
Yeah, and I love the framing of it and the invitation to become more curious with as resistance comes along. I was in a workshop just a few days ago in DC with my team, the group that I support, and there were a lot of things like, but they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So what do I do about that? But they're still not doing it. And in a way, it was like it became a whole loop. And at one point, we looked at the ladder of inference and said, well, what's available data that you have? And my thing to them was, if someone is doing something and it does not make sense at all, then it's a relational thing. So what do? You check in with them. And, you know, like it's a shift that you forget about whether they're doing something or not. There's a human component to that. So be curious about the relational matter at hand, and do they feel safe? Is there something else that's stopping them? And then that the dialogue that you're proposing, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing for any change manager, anyone really, just to, you know, to use. So I love that whole how you've positioned resistance and invited dialogue.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, for me, it's an immediate reaction to ask, to seek more, to have a conversation. That's in my DNA, and I'm, you know, on a mission to help others do that. But it's not always the case for leaders, and often, you know, there's instant presumption that non-compliance is a performance issue, and that's usually not the case. You know, people don't come to work to be bad performers. There's usually a really good reason as to why somebody is resisting. And I think if we go into it with that, you know, as you said, Samuel, that curious mind, why is this happening? Not how am I going to solve it? First question is why.
Yeah, I think Claire's got quite a good. Oh, Larissa, go for it.
I was just going to ask a question. In terms of, like, I can see the power of having a conversation being extremely important, especially in my current project, where at this point the leadership they make assumptions, they know better. So and also the department, I work for the Department of Education, so there is a top-down, like, kind of assumption right now that the schools are too busy to be delivered to. And so, number one, we don't get engagement to actually co-create. We don't get an understanding of what they actually need, whether the solution that we're delivering to them is going to be sufficient, and actually, but we have to deliver. Secondly, then we've got I have resistance within the project, so I raised a question like the value of change management, because what I'm finding is that my technical team are making decisions and then not necessarily refusing, but they forget or don't involve me. So then all my materials need to change, and so I feel like the conversations being had and also trust being built or being misplaced. So I find that it's interesting listening to all of this. It's so pertinent to my situation, in that the conversations at various levels are so key, whether it's within your project, whether it's talking up to the project, whether it's out who you're delivering to. All of them are so valuable in some way or another, and can really hamper a project when they're not had in a really sort of safe environment where people are open and actually that trust is there, and you know that being done to. So I'm finding this extremely beneficial, and it would be great to have a conversation beyond this, because it's ongoing, and
it is,
which is strange considering it's it's kind of meant to be I don't know. Anyway, it's an interesting situation.
Yeah, thank you, Larissa. And look, I think that comes back to my my A statement around trust, it's a fuel, it's a catalyst. And it doesn't matter if you're it doesn't matter where you're having the conversation in the, in the organization. Having the conversation itself moves us along. The sheer fact that you have engaged is moving people along. The sheer fact that you've reached out is moving the project along. And, even what can be lost by trying to have a conversation, really? What's the disbenefit of that?
Love that. And Paul, I mean, my reflection on this is I think every time we have a conversation with someone, both parties or all parties seem to leave different, because every conversation has the potential to change you, to shift your meaning, to satisfy curiosity and understand. And I think the key lesson here is we need to help our clients stop seeing resistance as bad or a failure in change. It's actually feedback. And I think if people, the way we look at it at Mars, and if we're training up and building capability within our clients, we sort of say, well, all resistance is feedback. We need to allow the space where people can express it, have a conversation, listen to it, respond to it. And I'm not saying you have to agree with everything people say, but the response is critical, saying, look, I hear you, and this is why we're doing it differently.
Yeah,
so
I think there's a part of that. I agree wholeheartedly, obviously, but I do find that managers generally, particularly senior managers, believe that a conversation is not giving so they confuse giving people a voice with giving people a vote.
Yes.
And so for me, that's very, very, very important that we give people a voice. We want people to be listened to, co-create all of that stuff. But employees don't get to choose. Leaders get to make the decision. They don't have a vote.
Yeah.
They have a voice.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a barrier to leaders having conversations. They have a perception that if I ask, then I've got to respond to what they want.
And a
So
response doesn't have to be compliance. So that's what I love. It doesn't have to say, yes, employees, whatever you want. It's just having an adult to adult conversation and having those spaces that we create.
Yeah.
So folks, Paul, thank you so much. What we're going to do now is I'd like to ask the group, if you can jump in the chat, let's have a bit of a reflection as a group, as a team. And jump into the chat and let us know what was your best part of the session today on deep resistance. Let us know your key takeaway, your key aha moments, what you loved about it, just so that we can sort of hone in as a group together on what we've just learned. And it'll probably allow us to practice it a little bit sooner. I love a good reflection after any kind of learning. So feel free, I invite you to jump into the chat. Let us know what you liked. Let us know your key takeaway and what was your best part on our session with Paul today. There's some good ones here. So we've got the diagnostic is great. Laverne loved that diagnostic tool. So we will share the video. And Paul, you're welcome to pop your slides in the Space for Change LinkedIn group. If you haven't already joined, we have a group on LinkedIn called Space for Change. That's the space where we vote. That's the space where we all have a voice and vote on topics every month and what's important. And that's where we also find speakers amongst ourselves or friends that you know to help shed some light on some really tricky situations, because change is complex. Bronwyn loved the resistance recipes and the matrix method. I love a good matrix as well. Thanks for that. Larissa says conversations are key. C. Rogers, Claire, was it Claire? Karen. Resistance is feedback. Parents said amazing, such great conversations. I want more. Great. Well, we do this monthly, so come join, and you can reach out to anyone in this community if you want more conversations. The grid put it in perspective. Thanks, Paul and Earth to Mars. Love it. Andrew says, ask why people are resisting. Absolutely, it's the root cause. Samuel says, love how the model was presented and the motivation behind it. Paul's relationship to resistance. I agree, it's quite inspiring to actually fall in love with resistance because that unlocks new conversations. Karen says, love the ladder of passive versus active. Isn't that great? That resistance isn't all about people resisting. It's also about how we proactively handle resistance and address resistance ourselves. Oh, Hugo's popped the link in there in the chat if you'd like to join Space for Change. I think there's about 450 of us at the moment, and we're all curious and interested about exploring it. Bronwood would love to receive the video. Absolutely. My team puts it up on our Earth to Mars TV YouTube channel. So that happens in the next week or so, but we'll let you know. Claire said the models were brilliant. They made the complex simple. We love the stories. I love the Space for Change because there was so much sharing of stories here in relation, particularly the Wharfies. I agree, Claire. I've worked with Wharfies and really they are tribal. So I had to wake up at 4 in the morning and spend time with their tribe before they trusted me with change. So I'm glad we share that. Ingrid said, is it why or how conversation? Got to go, guys. Have a great day. Thanks, Ingrid. What's the barrier? Is that why conversation or how? Sandra said discussion is the key aspect. Adam loved the antidotes from Paul. Thank you. Karen says this discussion, it needs to be had. It's like resistance is so common, but when have we actually just sat and had a real conversation about it? I thank you for that. Karen Strauss from South Africa, giving people a voice and not a vote is really important for leaders. It's a nice way to help them swallow that pill. And the times we get people to vote on is more about preferences, not necessarily the overall. Definitely the diagnostic, Daniel loved. Thanks, Daniel. Trusting, not telling, Laverne. I love that. Hey, that's all in Paul's book. So have a check of that. Darian loved the diagnostic piece, but also reframing the conversation. I think that's key. And that's what we do a lot as change managers. We reframe. So make stakeholders look at the steps. But the first step is always asking a question and having a convo. Wow, Darian, you summed that up so nicely. Thank you. Deline loved it. Insightful. Resistance recipes. It was a bit of a recipe, wasn't it? Karen, the why and the how, the model was great. Jason loved the grid, simple and effective on demonstrating. You can take that and educate your clients on resistance now. Isn't that awesome? Larissa has had the breakthrough that resistance gives you the biggest learnings for change projects. Don't worry about misspelling names, Daniel. I misspell all the time. You're safe zone here. Sandra, so good to see you. Sandra, these sessions always unlock new ways of thinking and love the global change community. We love that too, and hope to be intergalactic one day as well for those who are going to be working on Mars with me one day. Shirley Ann loved the Ladder of Impact. It will shape conversations at different levels. Isn't it awesome? Glad you got a good takeaway there. And Karen said, I don't feel so alone in change. I know, that's why we set up this community, because change can feel so lonely sometimes. We're sort of like in the middle with a sort of tomato in the sandwich getting squeezed by the executives and the front line. And it's really nice just to have this community. And that's what I got. So folks, thank you for your time today. Again, remember to join our Space for Change LinkedIn group to discuss future topics. I think we've already got a topic buzzing up around potentially spyware and sensors at work. I saw it in the chat. So I think that might also be a nice session to have after talking about trust for so long. All right. So folks, thank you so much. And Paul, any final thoughts?
I guess my whole thing is about go forth, have the conversation. What can possibly go wrong from just asking? Exactly.
Love it. Thank you, community, and have an intergalactic day. And thank you, team, for pulling this together. Appreciate it as always. See you later.
Thanks, everybody.